Picture this. May 1945. Nazi Germany has just collapsed, and the most evil men who ever lived are running for their lives. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. They didn't run to some remote jungle hideout. They didn't flee to secret Nazi bases in Antarctica. They hid right next to you. Rudolf Höss, the man who perfected the murder of over 1 million human beings at Auschwitz, was living quietly as a chicken farmer named Franz Lang. Just raising chickens. Like your neighbor. Joseph Kramer, who the British would call the Beast of Belsen, simply walked away from his death camp and vanished into the chaos of defeated Germany. Armand Goeth, who shot prisoners from his balcony for morning entertainment, was out there somewhere, probably asking for directions or buying groceries. Think about that for a second. The architects of genocide, men who had turned mass murder into a daily routine, were now living ordinary lives. Maybe working in shops, maybe teaching children, maybe living on your street. But here's what they didn't count on. Someone was coming for them. War crimes, investigators, Holocaust survivors, and obsessed prosecutors had started the greatest manhunt in human history. And they would never stop looking. What happens when pure evil tries to pretend it's normal? You're about to find out. Here's something that will absolutely mess with your head. Rudolf Höss, the man who killed more people than any single human being in history, was hiding as a chicken farmer named Franz Lang. Not in some remote mountain hideout. Not in a fortified bunker. On a quiet farm in northern Germany, feeding chickens and collecting eggs like any other day laborer. This is the same man who had perfected the industrial murder of human beings at Auschwitz. The same man who had turned genocide into a business operation. The same man who came home every evening to kiss his wife and children after spending his day organizing the deaths of thousands. And now he was Franz Lang, simple farm worker. But Höss wasn't alone in his vanishing act. Across the smouldering ruins of Nazi Germany, concentration camp commandants were melting into the chaos like ghosts. The Third Reich had collapsed so completely, so suddenly, that entire Nazi hierarchies just evaporated. One day, they were running death camps. The next day, they were refugees, with forged papers and new names. Picture the scene in May 1945. Germany wasn't just defeated, it was obliterated. Cities reduced to rubble. Millions of people wandering the roads with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Displaced persons, former prisoners, German civilians, foreign workers, all moving in desperate rivers of humanity across a broken continent. It was the perfect cover for war criminals to disappear. The SS had prepared for this moment. They'd known the war was lost months before it ended. Secret orders had gone out: destroy the evidence, scatter the personnel, prepare escape routes. False identity papers were mass-produced. New backstories were memorized. Entire biographies were rewritten overnight. Joseph Kramer, the Beast of Belsen, simply walked away from his camp when the British arrived. One moment he was there, overseeing a hell on earth where 60,000 prisoners were dying of starvation and disease. The next moment, gone, vanished into the streams of refugees. For weeks, he was just another displaced German trying to get home. Amon Goeth, the sadistic commandant of Poichot, who shot prisoners from his villa balcony for sport, had been arrested by his own SS colleagues for corruption. But in the chaos of Germany's collapse, even SS prisons became evacuation points. Goeth found himself mixed in with thousands of other prisoners being moved west, away from the advancing Red Army. The perfect opportunity to slip away and become someone else entirely. And then there were the rat lines. These weren't just escape routes, they were underground railways for war criminals. Networks of sympathizers, Catholic clergy, and former Nazi officials who helped smuggle SS officers and concentration camp personnel out of Europe entirely. Some headed for South America, others aimed for the Middle East. Anywhere but Europe, where their faces might be recognized. The most popular destination? Argentina. Under Juan Perón, Argentina had become a haven for fleeing Nazis. The journey typically started in Rome, where certain Vatican officials provided false passports and documentation. From there, it was a ship to Buenos Aires and a new life in South America. Thousands of Nazi war criminals made this journey, including concentration camp guards, SS officers, and even some commandants who would remain hidden for decades. But here's what's truly chilling about this great vanishing act. These men didn't just disappear, they adapted. They learned new trades. They married local women. They had children who grew up never knowing their father's true identity. They became shopkeepers, mechanics, farmers, teachers. They joined local churches. They coached youth sports teams. They became pillars of their communities. Rudolf Höss was particularly good at this reinvention. Working as a farm laborer in Gottrapel near Flensburg, he was known as a quiet, hard-working man. His fellow workers had no idea that this mild-mannered farmhand had once commanded the largest extermination facility in human history. He tended animals with the same methodical precision he had once applied to mass murder. The irony is almost unbearable. Some of these men lived double lives for years. By day, they were ordinary citizens of their adopted countries. By night, they might gather with other former SS officers, reminiscing about the good old days and maintaining their twisted ideology. They created informal networks, helping each other with jobs, documentation, and emotional support. They were a shadow community of mass murderers hiding in plain sight. The psychological aspect of this transformation is staggering. How does a man who spent years orchestrating the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people suddenly become a quiet farm worker? How does he look at himself in the mirror each morning? How does he interact with neighbors, knowing what he's capable of? Some historians believe many of these men genuinely convinced themselves they were different people now. The compartmentalization that had allowed them to be family men and mass murderers simultaneously now allowed them to become entirely new identities. But here's the thing about trying to erase your past when you've committed the worst crimes in human history. Someone, somewhere, is always keeping records. Someone is always taking notes. Someone is always making lists. And in 1945, as these war criminals were congratulating themselves on their successful disappearing acts, teams of investigators were already beginning the greatest manhunt in human history. The hunters were coming, and they would never stop looking. While Nazi war criminals were busy reinventing themselves as ordinary citizens, something extraordinary was happening in the ruins of Europe. Teams of investigators, part detective, part historian, part avenger, were assembling for what would become the most relentless pursuit of justice in human history. These weren't just Allied officers doing their duty. These were the real-life inglorious bastards. Meet Captain Hans Alexander, a German Jew who had fled Nazi Germany in the 1930s, only to return as a British intelligence officer hunting the very people who had tried to exterminate his family. Alexander spoke perfect German, understood Nazi psychology, and had something that made him absolutely relentless: personal stakes. This wasn't just a job for him. This was settling the score for 6 million dead Jews, including members of his own family. Alexander was part of the War Crimes Investigation Team, a multinational group that included American CIC officers, British intelligence agents, French resistance fighters, and Holocaust survivors who had dedicated their lives to tracking down their former tormentors. They were smart, they were motivated, and they were absolutely ruthless in their pursuit. Some spoke multiple languages. Others had photographic memories for faces. All of them shared one obsession: finding every single Nazi war criminal who thought they had gotten away. But here's what made these investigators truly dangerous to fleeing Nazis. They understood that this wasn't just about catching individual criminals. This was a race against time to preserve evidence before it disappeared forever. Every day that passed, more documents were being destroyed. More witnesses were dying or scattering across the globe. More memories were fading. The investigators knew they had maybe 2 or 3 years to collect enough evidence to prosecute these crimes, or the chance for justice would be lost forever. So they launched what can only be described as the most intensive documentation project in history. Teams of investigators raced across Europe, collecting Nazi documents before they could be destroyed. They interviewed thousands of survivors while their memories were still fresh. They photographed crime scenes before nature could reclaim them. They gathered physical evidence: the gas chambers, the crematoria, the personal belongings of victims, before it could be cleaned up or forgotten. Alexander himself became obsessed with one particular case: Rudolf Höss. The commandant of Auschwitz had vanished completely after the camp's liberation, and Alexander knew that capturing him would be the ultimate prize. Höss wasn't just another Nazi war criminal. He was the architect of the Holocaust's most efficient killing machine. Finding him would be like capturing the devil himself. The investigation began with survivor testimonies. Alexander and his team interviewed hundreds of former Auschwitz prisoners, collecting detailed descriptions of Höss's appearance, his habits, his family situation, his personality quirks. They learned that he was a family man who loved his children. They learned that he had a distinctive walk. They learned about his wife Hedwig and their 5 children. Most importantly, they learned that he was probably hiding somewhere in northern Germany, possibly with relatives. But the investigators had one massive advantage that the fleeing Nazis hadn't fully appreciated. The Third Reich had been a bureaucracy of murder, and bureaucracies keep records. Detailed records. Obsessively detailed records. The Nazis had documented everything: personnel files, transfer orders, promotion records, family information, addresses, phone numbers, bank accounts. They had even photographed many of their war criminals for official identification purposes. As Allied forces overran Nazi administrative centers, they captured mountains of documentation, filing cabinets full of SS personnel records, boxes of concentration camp administrative files, photo albums of camp staff, even personal letters and family photographs that SS officers had left behind in their hurried escapes. The investigators realized they were sitting on a treasure trove of information that would allow them to track down virtually every Nazi war criminal in existence. Captain Alexander spent weeks going through captured SS files, looking for any information about Rudolf Höss. He found personnel records showing Höss's career progression. He found family information listing his wife and children. He found administrative documents showing where Höss had lived, what he had earned, even what kind of car he drove. Most crucially, he found information about Höss's extended family, brothers, sisters, in-laws who might be providing shelter to the fugitive commandant. The investigation also benefited from an unexpected source: Nazi bureaucratic rivalry. The SS had been notorious for internal power struggles and backstabbing. Officers who had grudges against their former colleagues were sometimes willing to provide information about their whereabouts. Others, facing prosecution themselves, offered information about higher-ranking officers in exchange for leniency. The investigators learned to exploit these personal animosities, turning Nazi against Nazi in their quest for information. Meanwhile, other teams were pursuing different targets. Joseph Kramer, the Beast of Belsen, had been captured relatively quickly because he had stayed in the British zone of occupation. But investigators were still hunting Armin Goeth, the sadistic commandant of Poichau. They knew he had been arrested by his own SS colleagues for corruption, but he had escaped during the chaos of Germany's collapse. Teams were scouring Austria and southern Germany, following leads and interviewing witnesses who might have seen him. The investigators also had to contend with a ticking clock. As the immediate shock of Germany's defeat wore off, war crimes prosecution was becoming less of a priority for the Allied governments. Politicians were more concerned with rebuilding Europe and containing Soviet expansion than with hunting down Nazi war criminals. The investigators knew they had a limited window of time and resources to find their targets before the political will for prosecution disappeared entirely. This urgency created an almost obsessive dedication among the investigators. They worked 18-hour days, following every lead, interviewing every potential witness, analyzing every document. Some, like Alexander, became personally consumed with their targets. They studied their quarry like a hunter studies his prey, learning their habits, their psychology, their weaknesses. They became experts not just in Nazi crimes, but in Nazi criminals as individual human beings. The investigation teams also had to be extremely careful about their own security. The fleeing Nazis had sympathizers everywhere, former colleagues, ideological supporters, people who were being paid to provide false identities and safe passage. Some investigators received death threats. Others discovered that their own offices had been infiltrated by Nazi sympathizers trying to warn their targets. The hunt for war criminals had become a deadly game of cat and mouse, played across a continent still scarred by war. By late 1945, the investigators had compiled detailed profiles, of hundreds of Nazi war criminals. They had photographs, physical descriptions, family information, known associates, possible hiding places. They had created a network of informants and sympathizers willing to report suspicious activities. They had established relationships with local police forces who could be trusted to assist in arrests. The net was closing around the fleeing Nazis, even if they didn't know it yet. And then, in March 1946, the first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A woman, desperate to protect her children, was about to give up the location of the most wanted Nazi war criminal in the world. The great manhunt was about to claim its biggest prize. April 15th, 1945. British soldiers of the 11th Armoured Division were advancing through northern Germany when they came across something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. What they found there was beyond human comprehension. Picture this scene. 60,000 prisoners, walking skeletons barely clinging to life. Tens of thousands of corpses scattered among the barracks like discarded dolls. The stench of death so overwhelming that battle-hardened soldiers vomited at the camp gates. And standing there, waiting for them with an arrogant smirk, was the man responsible for this hell on earth. Joseph Kramer, the Beast of Belsen. This wasn't some cowering Nazi trying to escape justice. This was a man who had stayed at his post until the very end, convinced he had done nothing wrong. When British officers demanded he help them understand what they were seeing, Kramer's response was chilling in its casual indifference. He treated the mass death around him like a minor, administrative problem. The British couldn't believe what they were dealing with. Here was a man who had transformed a concentration camp into a death trap through deliberate neglect and systematic starvation. Under his command, Bergen-Belsen had become a dumping ground for prisoners evacuated from camps in the east. What had once held 15,000 prisoners was now crammed with over 60,000, with no increase in food, medicine, or sanitation. Kramer had essentially created a slow-motion extermination camp. But here's what made Joseph Kramer truly dangerous and truly infuriating to his captors. He genuinely believed he had done his job well. When British officers confronted him with the horror they had discovered, Kramer didn't deny anything. He didn't claim ignorance. He didn't even seem embarrassed. Instead, he launched into detailed explanations of camp procedures, prisoner management, and resource allocation. As if mass death was just another bureaucratic challenge he had handled competently. The British interrogation of Kramer revealed the true banality of evil. This wasn't some wild-eyed fanatic spouting Nazi ideology. This was a middle-aged bureaucrat who spoke about mass murder the way other people might discuss inventory management. He had precise numbers for everything: how many prisoners had arrived, how many had died, how many calories per day each prisoner received. The horror wasn't that he was insane. The horror was that he was completely rational. Kramer's journey to Bergen-Belsen had taken him through the entire Nazi killing machine. He had started at Dachau in 1935 as an unemployed electrician looking for work. By 1940, he was working as an adjutant to Rudolf Höss at Auschwitz, learning the industrial techniques of mass murder. From there, he had commanded Natzweiler Struthof, where he had personally supervised the gassing of 86 Jewish prisoners for a grotesque anatomical collection at the University of Strasbourg. He had watched their agonies through a window, taking notes like a scientist observing lab rats. By 1944, Kramer had returned to Auschwitz-Birkenau as commandant during the peak of the Hungarian action, the systematic murder of over 400,000 Hungarian Jews in just a few months. Under his supervision, the gas chambers and crematoria operated at maximum efficiency. Trains arrived daily. Passengers were selected for immediate death or temporary slave labor, and the killing machine ran like clockwork. Kramer treated it all as a logistics exercise. When he was transferred to Bergen-Belsen in December 1944, Kramer brought his systematic approach to prisoner management. He abolished self-administration by Jewish prisoners. He reduced food rations to starvation levels. He crammed more and more prisoners into barracks designed for far fewer people. The result was predictable and probably intentional. Bergen-Belsen became a death camp through deliberate neglect rather than gas chambers. But Kramer's arrogance would be his downfall. Unlike other Nazi war criminals who fled or went into hiding, he actually tried to prevent British soldiers from entering the camp when they arrived. He argued with British officers about proper procedures. He demanded that they follow camp regulations. He acted like he was still in charge, as if the British were unwelcome visitors disrupting his efficient operation. The British response was swift and brutal. Colonel Taylor, the new British commandant of Bergen-Belsen, forced Kramer at gunpoint to carry wounded prisoners to the hospital. British soldiers made him walk through the piles of corpses he had created. They photographed him standing among the dead, documenting his crimes for the world to see. On April 17, 1945, Kramer was arrested and marched through the camp in shackles. The prisoners who could still stand cheered weakly as their former tormentor was led away. The trial of Joseph Kramer began on September 17, 1945, the first major war crimes trial, focused specifically on concentration camp atrocities. 45 defendants sat in the dock, but Kramer was clearly the star of this horrific show. The proceedings took place in Lüneburg, in a gymnasium specially converted for the trial. The world was watching. What made the testimony so powerful and so disturbing was the contrast between the survivors' accounts and Kramer's continued defiance. Survivor after survivor took the stand to describe the systematic brutality they had witnessed. They told of arbitrary executions, deliberate starvation, medical experiments, and casual cruelty beyond imagination. And through it all, Kramer sat unmoved, occasionally taking notes as if he were attending a professional conference. The prosecution presented evidence of Kramer's crimes not just at Bergen-Belsen, but throughout his career. They detailed his role in the gas chamber experiments at Natzweiler-Struthof. They documented his participation in the Hungarian action at Auschwitz. They showed how he had systematically transformed Bergen-Belsen into a death trap. The evidence was overwhelming, detailed, and absolutely damning. But Kramer's defense was even more chilling than his crimes. He never denied what he had done. He never claimed he was unaware of the consequences of his actions. Instead, he fell back on the defense that would become the standard Nazi excuse: "I was just following orders." He claimed he was a soldier doing his duty. He insisted he had fulfilled his responsibilities conscientiously and efficiently. He seemed to genuinely believe that systematic murder was acceptable as long as it was properly authorized. The most heartbreaking moment of the trial came when Kramer's wife Rosina took the stand as a character witness. She was a stenotapist who had married Kramer in 1937 and borne him 3 children. In her testimony, she painted a picture of a devoted family man who loved his children and was kind to animals. She described quiet evenings at home, family vacations, birthday parties for the children. She seemed genuinely unable to reconcile the husband she knew with the monster described by prosecutors and survivors. But her testimony only made Kramer's crimes more disturbing. How does a man play with his children in the evening after spending his day organizing mass murder? How does he kiss his wife goodnight after watching prisoners die of starvation? The trial revealed that Nazi war criminals weren't inhuman monsters. They were humans who had chosen to become monsters while maintaining the facade of ordinary family life. On November 17th, 1945, the verdict was announced. Joseph Kramer was sentenced to death by hanging. His response was to immediately petition Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery for clemency. In his petition, he continued to claim complete innocence, describing himself as a dedicated soldier who had remained at his post out of concern for the prisoners entrusted to his care. Even facing execution, he could not or would not acknowledge the magnitude of his crimes. The petition was rejected. On December 13th, 1945, Joseph Kramer was executed at Hamelin Prison. His executioner was Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's chief hangman, who would later describe the execution as routine and professional. Kramer went to his death, still claiming innocence, still insisting he had only done his duty. His final words echoed the defense he had maintained throughout his trial. "I am completely innocent of the crimes of which I am accused. I was merely a soldier carrying out the orders of my military superiors." But Joseph Kramer was small fry compared to what the investigators found next. While Kramer had been efficient and brutal, he had been operating within a system created by someone else. The real architect of the Holocaust's killing machine was still out there, somewhere in occupied Germany, living under an assumed name. Rudolf Höss, the commandant who had turned Auschwitz into the most deadly killing facility in human history, was about to discover that you can't hide from the past forever, especially when someone who loves you is willing to give you up to save someone else they love even more. March 11th, 1946. A quiet farm in the German countryside near Flensburg. Franz Lang was going about his morning routine, feeding chickens, collecting eggs, preparing for another day of simple farm labor. He had been living this peaceful life for almost a year, successfully reinventing himself as just another displaced German trying to rebuild after the war. His fellow farm workers knew him as a quiet, reliable man who kept to himself and did his job without complaint. What they didn't know was that Franz Lang was actually Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz and the architect of the most efficient killing machine in human history. The man feeding chickens had personally overseen the murder of over 1 million human beings. The quiet farm worker had turned genocide into an industrial process. And now, British intelligence officers were closing in on his location. The breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. Captain Hans Alexander and his war crimes investigation team had spent months tracking down leads about Höss's whereabouts. They had interviewed hundreds of former Auschwitz prisoners. They had analyzed captured SS personnel files. They had followed paper trails and investigated family connections. But the key to finding the world's most wanted war criminal would come from the person who loved him most. Hedwig Höss had been living with her 5 children in a small house near the Auschwitz camp, trying to maintain some semblance of normal family life. She knew her husband was in hiding, but she had no idea where. Rudolf had deliberately kept his location secret, even from his own family, to protect them from interrogation. For months, she had heard nothing from him and had no way to make contact. She was a woman trying to protect her children while living with the growing fear that her husband might never return. Then came the knock on her door that would change everything. British intelligence officers had finally tracked down the Höss family, and they had a simple but devastating proposition for Hedwig. They explained that they knew Rudolf was hiding somewhere in northern Germany. They explained that they would find him, eventually, with or without her help. But they also explained something else that made Hedwig's blood run cold. Your husband or your son goes to Siberia. That was the choice they gave her. Either she helped them locate Rudolf, or they would deport her eldest son Klaus to a Soviet prison camp as a suspected war criminal accomplice. The threat was clear, immediate, and absolutely credible. The Soviets were indeed deporting German civilians to labor camps, and children of high-ranking Nazis were particularly vulnerable. Hedwig was being forced to choose between her husband and her child. The psychological pressure was unbearable. Hedwig had lived for years in the shadow of her husband's crimes, maintaining the fiction of normal family life while knowing what he did during his working hours. She had hosted dinner parties for SS officers, while prisoners starved just outside their garden walls. She had raised her children in a house that overlooked one of history's greatest crime scenes. Now she was being asked to betray the father of her children to protect those same children from the consequences of his actions. After days of interrogation and psychological pressure, Hedwig broke. She revealed that Rudolf was hiding under the name Franz Lang, working as a farm laborer near Flensburg. She provided enough details about his location and appearance to allow the investigators to find him. In making this choice, she probably saved her son's life, but she also sealed her husband's fate. On March 11th, 1946, Captain Alexander and a team of British military police surrounded the farm where Höss was hiding. They found him in the workers' quarters, still living under his assumed identity. When confronted, Höss initially denied being the wanted man, claiming he was just a simple farm worker named Franz Lang. But the investigators had one piece of evidence that made denial impossible: his wedding ring. Despite changing his name, his appearance, and his entire life story, Rudolf Höss had kept wearing the wedding ring Hedwig had given him years earlier. Engraved inside the band were his real initials and wedding date. When investigators pointed this out, Höss's careful facade crumbled immediately. The man who had successfully hidden his identity for nearly a year was betrayed by his sentiment for his wife, the same wife who had been forced to give up his location. What happened next was one of the most chilling confessions in legal history. Rather than maintaining his denial or refusing to cooperate, Höss began talking. and talking, and talking. Over the next several days of interrogation, he provided investigators with a detailed, methodical, horrifyingly precise account of how the Holocaust had been planned, organized, and executed. The confession was extraordinary in its clinical detachment. Hurst described the construction of gas chambers with the same tone of voice another man might use to describe building a garage. He explained the logistics of mass murder, train schedules, prisoner processing, body disposal, as if he were giving a business presentation. He provided precise numbers: how many people could be killed per day, how long each gas chamber operation took, how the system had been refined for maximum efficiency. Listening to Hurst's confession was like getting a guided tour of hell from the devil himself. He explained how Auschwitz had been expanded from a traditional concentration camp into the largest extermination facility in history. He described receiving orders from Heinrich Himmler to implement the final solution and his methodical approach to turning those orders into operational reality. He detailed the experimentation with different killing methods before settling on Zyklon B gas as the most efficient option. But perhaps most disturbing was Hurst's complete lack of emotion while recounting these horrors. He never showed remorse, guilt, or even recognition that he was describing the worst crimes in human history. Instead, he seemed proud of his efficiency and innovation. He spoke about improving the killing process, about solving logistical challenges, about meeting production targets. He had so completely dehumanized his victims that their mass murder had become nothing more than an administrative problem to be solved. The interrogators found themselves in the surreal position of having to maintain professional composure while listening to a man calmly describe the systematic murder of over 1 million people. How do you interrogate someone who shows no understanding that what he did was wrong? How do you maintain objectivity when faced with such absolute evil? Some of the investigators, particularly those who were Holocaust survivors themselves, struggled with the impulse to simply execute Hurst on the spot. But they needed his testimony. Hurst was providing unprecedented insight into the Nazi killing machine, details that could only come from someone at the very top of the hierarchy. His confession would become crucial evidence in the Nuremberg trials and would help historians understand exactly how the Holocaust had been implemented. The investigators knew that Hurst's detailed admissions were worth more than any revenge they might extract through immediate execution. Hurst also provided information about other war criminals who were still at large. He named names, described the roles of various SS officers, and provided details about the locations and operations of other extermination camps. His confession became a roadmap for investigators, trying to track down the remaining architects of genocide. In a twisted way, his willingness to talk was helping to bring his fellow war criminals to justice. The psychological profile that emerged from Hurst's interrogation was deeply disturbing. This wasn't a sadistic psychopath who enjoyed inflicting pain. This wasn't a fanatic driven by ideological hatred. This was a bureaucrat who had approached mass murder as a career advancement opportunity. He had seen the final solution as a chance to demonstrate his administrative skills and prove his value to the Nazi hierarchy. He had turned genocide into a performance review. Hurst's matter-of-fact descriptions of family life at Auschwitz were particularly chilling. He talked about his wife's garden, his children's birthday parties, family dinners with other SS families. He described how he would come home each evening after a day of organizing mass murder and play with his children as if nothing unusual had happened. The cognitive compartmentalization required to maintain such a double life suggested a level of psychological detachment that was almost inhuman. By April 1946, investigators had extracted everything they could from Höss's confession. He had provided detailed testimony for the Nuremberg trials. He had helped identify other war criminals. He had given historians a complete blueprint of how the Holocaust had been implemented. Now it was time for him to face justice in the country where his worst crimes had been committed. Meanwhile, in Poland, another monster was about to face his victims. Szymon Goth, the sadistic commandant of Płaszów, who had shot prisoners from his villa balcony for sport, had finally been captured. Unlike Höss with his bureaucratic detachment, or Kramer with his professional arrogance, Goth had been a hands-on killer who seemed to enjoy the act of murder itself. The Polish people were about to get their chance at justice, and they were not in a forgiving mood. July 30th, 1946. Krakow's main railway station. A train from the American zone of occupied Germany pulled slowly into the platform, carrying two of the most notorious Nazi war criminals ever captured. Rudolf Höss, the architect of Auschwitz, sat quietly in his compartment, already resigned to his fate. But it wasn't Höss that the angry crowd of Polish civilians had come to see. They were there for Szymon Goth, the butcher of Płaszów, the man who had shot prisoners from his villa balcony for morning entertainment, the sadistic commandant who had turned a labor camp into his personal killing ground. And as the train doors opened, the crowd's rage erupted into something that nearly became a lynching. The moment Goth stepped onto the platform, the crowd surged forward. Shouts of murderer and butcher filled the air in Polish, German, and Yiddish. Hands reached out, trying to grab him, to tear him apart right there on the railway platform. Polish security forces had to form a human shield around their prisoner, physically fighting back the crowd of survivors and families of victims who wanted immediate revenge. This wasn't the quiet, professional arrest of other Nazi war criminals. This was personal. The crowd's fury was understandable. Szymon Goth hadn't just been another efficient bureaucrat of death like Höss or Kramer. He had been a hands-on killer who seemed to genuinely enjoy the act of murder. Survivors of Płaszów had spent months telling investigators about his daily routine of arbitrary execution. How he would stand on the balcony of his villa each morning with a high-powered rifle, looking for excuses to shoot prisoners. How a misinterpreted glance, a stumble during roll call, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time could result in instant death. But what made Goth particularly despised was the way he had turned murder into entertainment. Other commandants killed out of ideology, efficiency, or cold bureaucratic duty. Goth killed because he enjoyed it. Witnesses described how he would take target practice on prisoners while eating breakfast. How he would make bets with other SS officers about his shooting accuracy. How he would kill people just to demonstrate his power to visitors or new staff members. He had turned genocide into a blood sport. The security forces managed to get Goth away from the station alive, but barely. As his transport drove through the streets of Krakow toward the prison, crowds lined the route, shouting and throwing objects at the vehicle. Polish police had to close several streets to prevent riots. The man who had once terrorized this city from his hilltop villa was now getting a taste of what it felt like to be hunted. The trial of Amon Goeth began on August 27, 1946, before the Supreme National Court in Krakow. The courtroom was packed with survivors, journalists, and curious civilians who had managed to get tickets to what everyone knew would be the trial of the century. Outside, loudspeakers carried the proceedings to crowds who couldn't fit inside. This wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a moment of national catharsis for the Polish people. But when Goeth finally stood to face his accusers, something unexpected happened. The man who had once strutted around Płaszcz like a conquering emperor was now a broken, pathetic figure. Gone was the arrogant SS officer who had ruled over life and death with casual brutality. In his place stood a hollow-eyed, sickly-looking man who seemed to have aged decades in the 2 years since his arrest. Prison and the prospect of execution had transformed the butcher of Płaszcz into something almost pitiable. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Survivor after survivor took the stand to describe Goeth's reign of terror at Płaszcz. They told of morning executions conducted for his entertainment. They described his habit of killing prisoners who caught his attention for any reason, or no reason at all. They recounted how he had murdered at least 500 people with his own hands and ordered the deaths of thousands more. The testimony was graphic, detailed, and absolutely damning. One witness described watching Goeth shoot a young woman simply because she was walking too slowly to work detail. Another testified about Goeth killing a prisoner because the man had looked directly at him during roll call. A third described how Goeth had executed 2 prisoners as punishment when 2 others had escaped, a practice he called collective responsibility. Each account painted a picture of a man who had treated human life as completely disposable, who had killed not out of duty or ideology, but out of boredom and sadistic pleasure. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Helen Hirsch, a young Jewish woman who had worked as a maid in Goeth's villa. She described living in constant terror, never knowing when Goeth might decide to kill her on a whim. She told the court about his violent mood swings, his drinking, his casual brutality toward anyone within reach. She recounted how he would beat her unconscious for minor infractions, then act confused when she couldn't complete her work. Her testimony brought many in the courtroom to tears and made Goeth's pathetic attempts at denial even more grotesque. Because that's exactly what Goeth tried to do, deny everything. Despite the overwhelming evidence, despite dozens of eyewitness testimonies, despite photographic evidence of his crimes, Goeth maintained his innocence with a desperation that was almost comical. He claimed he had never personally killed anyone. He insisted that any deaths at Płaszcz had been the result of wartime conditions, not deliberate murder. He argued that he had actually tried to protect prisoners from worse treatment by other SS officers. The denials were so pathetic, so obviously false, that they seemed to anger the court more than a straightforward confession might have. Here was a man who had been photographed standing over mass graves, who had been seen by hundreds of witnesses committing murder, who had bragged about his killing to other SS officers, and he was trying to convince the court that he was innocent. The sheer audacity of his lies was almost more offensive than his original crimes. Goeth's defense strategy seemed to be based on the hope that if he denied everything loudly enough, and persistently enough, somehow the mountain of evidence against him would disappear. He questioned the credibility of witnesses, claiming they were lying out of spite. He argued that photographs had been doctored. He insisted that other SS officers were trying to frame him for their own crimes. It was the desperate flailing of a man who knew he was doomed, but couldn't accept responsibility for his actions even when facing death. The court wasn't buying any of it. On September 5th, 1946, Amon Goeth was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to death by hanging. His reaction was to immediately file a petition for clemency, still maintaining his innocence and claiming he was the victim of a conspiracy. Even facing execution, he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge what he had done or show any remorse for his victims. The execution was scheduled for September 13th, 1946, at Krakow's Montiopic prison. But even in death, Goeth would prove to be a problem. When the moment came for his execution, the rope prepared for the hanging proved to be too long for his height. The first attempt failed. Prison officials had to adjust the length and try again. The second attempt also failed. It wasn't until the third try that the execution was successfully completed. Some witnesses saw poetic justice in the botched execution. Here was a man who had killed hundreds of people with casual efficiency, now struggling to die himself. Others saw it as a final humiliation for someone who had once held the power of life and death over thousands. But perhaps the most fitting aspect of Goeth's difficult death was that it took so long, giving him time to contemplate what he had done, even if he would never admit it. The question that haunted investigators, prosecutors, and historians was simple. What drives a man to shoot people from his balcony for sport? Goeth hadn't been born a monster. He had grown up in a middle-class family in Vienna, worked in his parents' bookstore, lived a normal life until his 30s. What psychological transformation had turned an ordinary Austrian shopkeeper into one of history's most sadistic killers? The answer seemed to lie in the intoxicating combination of absolute power and ideological permission. The Nazi system had given Goeth unlimited authority over the lives of his prisoners, while simultaneously telling him that those prisoners were subhuman enemies who deserved to die. For someone with latent sadistic tendencies, this was like giving a pyromania a flamethrower and telling him that burning things down was his patriotic duty. The Nazi ideology didn't create his cruelty. It just gave him permission to express it without consequences. But Goeth's case also revealed something disturbing about human nature itself. How many ordinary people, given the same power and permission, might have made the same choices? How many of us have the capacity for such evil lurking beneath the surface of civilized behavior? Goeth's transformation from shopkeeper to mass murderer suggested that the line between civilization and barbarism might be thinner than anyone wanted to believe. With Goeth's execution, another chapter in the pursuit of Nazi war criminals had closed. But the investigators were about to discover something that would shock even them, evidence that the SS had sometimes turned on its own members when their crimes became too extreme even for Nazi standards. Karl Otto Koch, the former commandant of Buchenwald, had been executed not by Allied justice, but by an SS firing squad. Even the Nazis, it seemed, had limits. Here's something that will blow your mind about Nazi Germany. On April 5th, 1945, just 3 days before the Americans liberated Buchenwald concentration camp, an SS firing squad executed one of their own officers right there on the campgrounds. Karl Otto Koch, the former commandant of Buchenwald, was shot by his fellow SS men for corruption and murder. Yes, you heard that right. The Nazis executed one of their own concentration camp commandants for murder. Even they thought he had gone too far. This wasn't some last-minute attempt at damage control or public relations. This was the result of a years-long internal investigation by the SS itself into crimes that were considered excessive, even by Nazi standards. The story of Koch's downfall reveals something terrifying about how the Nazi system operated. They had rules, procedures, and limits for their mass murder. And when someone violated those rules, even other Nazis wanted them dead. Karl Otto Koch had risen through the ranks of the concentration camp system during the 1930s, eventually becoming commandant of Buchenwald in July 1937. On paper, he looked like the perfect Nazi administrator, efficient, ruthless, and completely dedicated to the party ideology. But Koch had a problem that would eventually destroy him. He couldn't resist the temptation to enrich himself through his position. And in the Nazi system, stealing from the state was considered worse than murdering prisoners. The investigation into Koch began in November 1941, when Josias Prince of Waldeck-Pyrmont, the higher SS and police leader responsible for Buchenwald, received reports about massive corruption at the camp. Prisoners were dying in huge numbers, but somehow the camp's official records didn't match the reality of what was happening. Money was disappearing. Valuables taken from prisoners were not being properly accounted for. And there were whispers about prisoners being murdered to cover up Koch's crimes. What made this investigation particularly explosive was who was conducting it. SS Judge Konrad Morgan was known throughout the SS as an absolutely incorruptible investigator who pursued Nazi war criminals with the same relentless determination that Allied prosecutors would later show. But Morgan wasn't investigating crimes against humanity. He was investigating crimes against Nazi regulations. The SS had strict rules about how stolen property should be handled, how prisoners should be killed, and how the bureaucracy of genocide should operate. Koch had violated those rules, and that made him a traitor to the Nazi cause. The evidence against Koch was staggering in its scope. Investigators found that he and his wife Ilse, who would become infamous as the Witch of Buchenwald, had been systematically looting valuables taken from prisoners. They had accumulated massive amounts of money, jewelry, and artwork. They had furnished their quarters with stolen goods and lived a lifestyle far beyond what their official salaries should have allowed. But the corruption was just the beginning of their crimes. Koch had also been murdering prisoners to cover up his corruption. When prisoner nurses who had treated Koch for syphilis became potential witnesses to his crimes, he had them shot while attempting to escape. When other prisoners discovered evidence of his theft, they mysteriously died in accidents or were executed for disciplinary infractions. Koch was killing people not for ideological reasons or even sadistic pleasure, but simply to protect his criminal enterprise. To the SS investigators, this was the ultimate betrayal of Nazi principles. But the most shocking discovery was the role of Koch's wife, Ilse. She had not only participated in the corruption, but had developed her own twisted hobby that horrified even hardened SS officers. Ilse Koch collected lampshades, book covers, and other decorative items made from the tattooed skin of prisoners. She would have prisoners with interesting tattoos killed, so she could add their skin to her collection. Even by the standards of a regime that had made mass murder into state policy, this level of sadistic perversion was considered beyond acceptable limits. The investigation revealed that the Kochs had turned Buchenwald into their personal kingdom of corruption and murder. They threw lavish parties for SS officers, while prisoners starved. They accumulated wealth that would have made them rich, even in peacetime. They lived in luxury, while thousands died just outside their windows. But what made their crimes unforgivable to the SS was not the suffering they caused. It was the fact that they had profited personally from that suffering. SS Judge Morgan's investigation took on the character of a police procedural, complete with forensic evidence, witness testimony, and detailed financial audits. He interviewed hundreds of SS personnel and prisoners, looking for evidence of Koch's crimes. He analyzed bank records and property transfers. He even exhumed bodies to determine causes of death. The investigation was more thorough than many Allied war crimes investigations would be, because the SS had unlimited resources and complete access to all evidence. The most disturbing aspect of the investigation was how it revealed the Nazi system's warped sense of morality. Morgan and his team were not investigating whether Koch had committed murder. They knew he had, and they didn't particularly care. They were investigating whether he had committed unauthorized murder. The Nazi system had clear procedures for killing prisoners, and Koch had violated those procedures for personal gain. That made him not just a criminal, but a traitor to the Nazi state. On August 24, 1943, Koch was arrested by the Gestapo at his quarters in Buchenwald. His wife was arrested simultaneously. The arrests were conducted with the same efficiency and brutality that the SS showed toward other prisoners, but with an added element of betrayal. Koch was being arrested by his own colleagues, people who had once been his friends and partners in genocide. The Nazi system was literally devouring itself. The trial began in September 1944, conducted entirely within the SS legal system. This wasn't a public proceeding. It was an internal disciplinary action designed to clean up the Nazi administration of genocide. 22 witnesses testified, including both SS personnel and prisoners. The evidence was overwhelming, and the verdict was inevitable. Koch was sentenced to death for corruption, unauthorized murder, and betrayal of his oath to the SS. But here's where the story becomes truly surreal. As the war was ending and Allied forces were approaching Buchenwald, the SS was still determined to carry out Koch's execution. They could have simply released him or allowed him to escape in the chaos of Germany's collapse. Instead, they organized a formal firing squad execution right there in the camp he had once commanded. On April 5, 1945, as American tanks were rolling toward Buchenwald, SS officers were executing their former colleague for violating Nazi principles. Koch's last words were reportedly, "Boys, shoot well," a final attempt to maintain some dignity, even as he was being killed by his own comrades. The execution was carried out with typical German efficiency, even though the entire Nazi system was collapsing around them. 3 days later, American forces would liberate Buchenwald and discover the full extent of the horrors that had been committed there. But they would also find the execution site where the SS had killed one of their own. Ilse Koch's fate was even more complicated. she was acquitted by the SS court, which found that while she had been involved in corruption, she had not technically violated SS regulations regarding the treatment of prisoners. The court ruled that her collection of human skin items, while disturbing, did not constitute unauthorized murder, since the prisoners in question had been killed for other reasons. The Nazi legal system's ability to rationalize even the most grotesque crimes was apparently limitless. But Ilse's acquittal by the SS would not save her from Allied justice. After the war, she was arrested by American forces and tried for war crimes. Her case became a sensation in the American press, where she was dubbed the Witch of Buchenwald and became a symbol of Nazi depravity. She was eventually sentenced to life imprisonment, though her sentence was later commuted, and she was released in 1952, only to be rearrested and tried again by German courts. The Koch case revealed something deeply disturbing about the Nazi system. It had become so institutionalized, so bureaucratic, that even mass murderers could be held accountable for violating its twisted rules. The SS was not just a gang of criminals running amok. It was an organized, regulated system with procedures, oversight, and internal justice mechanisms. In some ways, this made it even more frightening than simple chaos would have been. Evil had been systematized, regulated, and made routine. But the execution of Carl Otto Koch also demonstrated something else. The Nazi war criminal justice system was incredibly limited in its scope. Koch was executed not for the thousands of prisoners who died under his command, but for violating Nazi bureaucratic procedures. The SS was perfectly willing to overlook mass murder as long as it was properly authorized and conducted according to regulations. They only drew the line when their own people started profiting personally from the genocide. As 1945 ended and the full scope of Nazi crimes became clear to the world, the Koch case stood as a bizarre footnote to the Holocaust. Here was proof that even the perpetrators of genocide had recognized that some behavior was unacceptable, but their definition of unacceptable had nothing to do with human decency or moral standards. It was purely about maintaining the efficiency and integrity of their system of mass murder. But while the Nazis had been busy executing their own corrupt officials, the biggest fish of all was still swimming free. Rudolf Höss, the architect of Auschwitz, and the man who had killed more people than any individual in human history, was about to face justice in the country where his worst crimes had been committed. The Polish people had been waiting for their moment of reckoning with the man who had turned their homeland into a charnel house. And they were not going to be as restrained as the British had been with other Nazi war criminals. May 25th, 1946. A military transport plane lifted off from Nuremberg airfield, carrying the most notorious war criminal in human history back to the scene of his greatest crimes. Rudolf Höss, the architect of Auschwitz, was being extradited to Poland to face justice in the country where he had perfected the art of mass murder. As the plane flew east over the German countryside, Höss sat quietly in shackles, probably reflecting on the irony of his situation. The man who had once held the power of life and death over millions was now completely powerless, being delivered to his victims like a package. The decision to try Höss in Poland rather than at Nuremberg was deliberate and symbolic. The Polish government had demanded his extradition, arguing that his worst crimes had been committed on Polish soil against Polish citizens. They wanted him to face justice where he had built his killing machine, They wanted him to stand trial in the shadow of the gas chambers he had designed. Most of all, they wanted the world to see that Poland would never forget what had been done to its people. When Huss's plane landed in Warsaw, there was no angry mob like the one that had greeted Amon Goeth in Krakow. Instead, there was something more ominous, a cold, methodical determination to extract every possible detail about his crimes before executing him. The Polish authorities weren't interested in quick vengeance. They wanted a complete historical record of how the Holocaust had been implemented. They wanted Huss to document his own evil in excruciating detail. Huss was transported by train from Warsaw to Krakow, then taken directly to a prison cell that had been specially prepared for him. The cell was Spartan, but adequate. A desk, a chair, writing materials, and all the time in the world to reflect on what he had done. The Polish authorities had a simple request. They wanted him to write his autobiography. They wanted him to explain, in his own words, how a middle-class German had become the greatest mass murderer in history. What Huss wrote in that cell over the following months became one of the most chilling documents in human history. Not because it showed remorse. It didn't. Not because it revealed hidden depths of evil. It didn't do that either. What made Huss's autobiography so terrifying was its complete banality. He wrote about mass murder the way other people might write about managing a factory or organizing a supply chain. Listen to this passage from Huss's own words. The killing itself took the least time. You could dispose of 2,000 head in half an hour, but it was the burning that took all the time. He referred to human beings as head, like cattle. He discussed murder in terms of processing efficiency. He treated genocide as a logistics problem that he had solved with German engineering precision. Or this description of receiving orders for the final solution. In the summer of 1941, I was summoned to Berlin to Reichsführer SS Himmler to receive personal orders. He told me that the Führer had given the order for a final solution of the Jewish question. We, the SS, must carry out that order. I was to establish an extermination camp at Auschwitz. No emotion. No recognition of the magnitude of what he was being asked to do. Just a straightforward description of receiving what he considered routine orders. The most disturbing sections dealt with his family life at Auschwitz. Huss wrote lovingly about his wife's garden, where she grew flowers and vegetables just outside the camp perimeter. He described birthday parties for his children, family picnics, quiet evenings at home reading bedtime stories. All of this happening literally within sight and smell of the gas chambers and crematoria where thousands of people were being murdered daily. The compartmentalization was so complete that he seemed genuinely unable to see any contradiction between his roles as loving father and efficient killer. My family, to be sure, were well provided for in Auschwitz, he wrote. Every wish that my wife or children expressed was granted them. The children could live a free and untroubled life. My wife's garden was a paradise of flowers. Meanwhile, just beyond that garden wall, human ashes were fertilizing the soil and the smoke from burning bodies was drifting over his children's playground. The autobiography also revealed Huss's twisted sense of professional pride. He wrote about improving the killing process, about solving technical problems with the gas chambers, about increasing the efficiency of body disposal. He compared his work to that of other extermination camp commandants, noting with satisfaction that Auschwitz had achieved higher processing rates than competing facilities. He had turned genocide into a competition where success was measured in body counts. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Höss's writing was his complete inability to understand why he was being prosecuted. He repeatedly emphasized that he had only been following orders, that he had fulfilled his duties conscientiously, that he had worked harder than anyone else to achieve the goals set by his superiors. In his mind, he deserved praise for his efficiency, not prosecution for his crimes. He seemed genuinely confused by the fact that the world saw him as a monster rather than a dedicated civil servant. The trial of Rudolf Höss began on March 11th, 1947, in Warsaw. The courtroom was packed with survivors, journalists, and observers from around the world who had come to see the architect of Auschwitz face justice. But unlike the emotional trials of other Nazi war criminals, Höss's proceeding had an almost clinical atmosphere. The evidence was so overwhelming, the defendant's guilt so obvious, that the trial felt more like a historical seminar than a legal proceeding. Höss's own testimony was the most damning evidence against him. He confirmed every detail of the prosecution's case, providing precise numbers, dates, and methods. He explained how the gas chambers worked, how many people could be killed per day, how the selection process operated. He answered every question with the same methodical precision he had once applied to mass murder. He was essentially serving as the prosecution's star witness against himself. The defense attempted to argue that Höss had been following orders and should therefore be treated as a soldier rather than a criminal. But this argument fell flat when confronted with the scale and systematic nature of his crimes. The court pointed out that even soldiers have a duty to refuse illegal orders, and that the systematic murder of civilians violated every principle of international law. Höss's efficiency in carrying out genocide was not a mitigating factor, it was an aggravating one. On April 2nd, 1947, Rudolf Höss was sentenced to death. His reaction was typically understated. He showed no emotion, made no dramatic speech, displayed no recognition of the justice of his sentence. He simply nodded and asked when the execution would take place. Even facing death, he treated the proceedings as just another administrative matter to be handled efficiently. The Polish authorities had one final symbolic gesture planned. Rather than executing Höss in Warsaw or Krakow, they decided to carry out his death sentence at Auschwitz itself. They wanted him to die where he had killed so many others. They wanted his last site to be the camp he had built, the gas chambers he had designed, the crematoria where he had burned his victims. It was the ultimate act of poetic justice. On April 16th, 1947, Rudolf Höss was transported back to Auschwitz for the last time. A gallows had been erected just outside his former residence, within sight of the gas chambers and crematoria. As he was led to his execution, Höss could see the ruins of his killing machine spread out before him. The camp that had once been his kingdom was now his execution ground. Höss's final words were reportedly brief and unrepentant. He maintained his innocence, claimed he had only done his duty, and expressed no remorse for his victims. Even at the moment of death, he could not acknowledge the magnitude of his crimes or the suffering he had caused. The man who had killed over 1 million people died as he had lived, without empathy, without conscience, without humanity. The execution was carried out at Auschwitz on the morning of April 16th, 1947. As Hus's body hung from the gallows, survivors and former prisoners gathered to witness the end of the man who had terrorized them. Some wept. Others stood in silent contemplation. But all understood that they were witnessing a moment of historical justice, the architect of genocide meeting his end in the very place where he had perfected the art of mass murder. The symbolism was powerful and deliberate. Rudolf Höss had returned to Auschwitz one final time, not as its commandant, but as its victim. The man who had once decided who lived and who died was now subject to that same absolute judgment. The place that had been synonymous with death and suffering had become the site of justice and closure. In the end, Auschwitz itself had claimed its most notorious commandant. Here's the thing that will absolutely infuriate you about Nazi war criminals. Some of them got away with it by dying before justice could catch up with them. Theodor Eicke, the man who created the entire concentration camp system, who designed the template for mass murder, who trained a generation of commandants in the art of genocide. He died a hero's death in combat in 1943. While other Nazi war criminals faced execution or life imprisonment, Eicke was posthumously celebrated as a fallen warrior. Death had cheated justice. February 26th, 1943. Eastern Front, near the Ukrainian town of Artemovsk. A small Fiesler Storch reconnaissance aircraft was flying over German lines when Soviet anti-aircraft fire found its target. The plane spiraled down in flames, killing both occupants instantly. One of those men was SS Oberfuhrer Theodor Eicke, commander of the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf, and the architect of the Nazi concentration camp system. In one moment, one of history's greatest war criminals had escaped earthly justice forever. The irony was overwhelming. While Joseph Kramer was facing trial for his crimes at Bergen-Belsen, while Rudolf Höss was being hunted across occupied Germany, while Eamon Goeth was hiding in Austria hoping to escape prosecution, Theodor Eicke was being honored with a military funeral and posthumous decorations. The man who had arguably done more than anyone except Hitler himself to create the machinery of the Holocaust was being remembered as a fallen hero rather than a war criminal. But who was Theodor Eicke, and why was his death such a tragedy for justice? If you want to understand how the Holocaust became possible, you have to understand this man. He wasn't just another Nazi official following orders. He was the architect who designed the entire system. Every concentration camp commandant who came after him was trained in his methods. Every gas chamber, every crematorium, every systematic murder was built on foundations he had laid. Eicke had taken command of Dachau concentration camp in June 1933, when it was still a relatively small facility for holding political prisoners. What he created there became the template for every concentration camp that followed. He established the organizational structure, the guard protocols, the prisoner classification systems, and most importantly, the psychological conditioning that allowed ordinary men to become mass murderers. Dachau under Eicke wasn't just a prison, it was a training school for genocide. The key to Eicke's system was what he called the hardening process. He deliberately recruited guards who showed potential for brutality, then systematically desensitized them to violence through training exercises that gradually escalated in cruelty. New guards started with verbal abuse of prisoners, then moved to physical punishment, then to arbitrary executions. By the time they were fully trained, they could kill without emotion, without hesitation, without conscience. Iker had created a factory for manufacturing killers. He also established the psychological framework that allowed concentration camp personnel to maintain their sense of moral righteousness while committing atrocities. Iker taught his men that they were defending Germany from its enemies, that prisoners were subhuman threats to the nation's survival, that showing mercy was a betrayal of their duty. He created an ideology that transformed mass murder into patriotic service. His guards didn't see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as heroes protecting the fatherland. The Death's Head units that Iker created became the backbone of the entire concentration camp system. By 1939, over 15,000 men had been trained in his methods and deployed to camps across Nazi-occupied Europe. They carried his organizational principles, his training methods, and his psychological indoctrination to every corner of the Nazi Empire. When new camps were established, Iker's men were there to set them up according to his specifications. The Holocaust was implemented by men who had learned their trade at Dachau under Theodor Eicher's personal supervision. But Eicher's influence extended far beyond individual training. He had created the bureaucratic structures that made systematic murder possible on an industrial scale. He established standardized procedures for prisoner intake, classification, work assignments, punishment, and execution. He created reporting systems that tracked deaths, transfers, and camp populations with Germanic precision. He turned genocide into a routine administrative function that could be managed by clerks and accountants. When war broke out in 1939, Eicher faced a choice. He could remain in charge of the concentration camp system, overseeing the expansion and intensification of the killing process. Or he could pursue military glory by taking his Death's Head units into combat as a Waffen-SS division. Eicher chose the military option, perhaps because he was bored with administrative duties, or perhaps because he genuinely believed he could serve the Nazi cause better as a combat commander. The 3rd SS Panzer Division, Totenkopf, that Eicher commanded was unique among German military units. Unlike regular Wehrmacht divisions, which maintained at least some adherence to military law and the Geneva Convention, the Totenkopf Division treated warfare as an extension of concentration camp operations. They routinely executed prisoners of war, murdered civilians, and conducted reprisals against non-combatants. Eicher had taken his concentration camp mentality to the battlefield. The division's first major action came during the 1940 campaign in France, where they committed some of their earliest war crimes. At Le Paradis, Totenkopf troops murdered nearly 100 British prisoners of war in cold blood. At other locations, they executed French civilians suspected of resistance activities. These weren't isolated incidents or heat-of-battle decisions. They were the systematic application of Eicher's concentration camp methods to military operations. But it was on the Eastern Front that Eicher's division truly revealed its character. The war against the Soviet Union was explicitly defined by Nazi leadership as a racial war of extermination, and the Totenkopf division embraced this mission with enthusiasm. They participated in mass executions of Soviet prisoners of war, murdered Jewish civilians, and helped implement the systematic starvation policies that killed millions of Soviet citizens. For Eike and his men, the Eastern Front was just a larger version of a concentration camp. The division fought with fanatical determination but also suffered enormous casualties. During the advance toward Leningrad, they lost over 80% of their original strength in fierce fighting around Demyansk. Eike himself was wounded multiple times, but refused evacuation, driving his men forward with the same ruthless determination he had once applied to running concentration camps. He seemed to view military casualties the same way he had viewed prisoner deaths, as acceptable losses in service of a greater cause. By early 1943, the Totenkopf division was being rebuilt and re-equipped for another offensive. Eike was planning his participation in Operation Citadel, the massive German offensive that would become the Battle of Kursk. He was conducting aerial reconnaissance flights to prepare for the coming battle, flying over Soviet positions to identify targets and plan attack routes. It was during one of these reconnaissance missions that Soviet anti-aircraft fire brought down his small aircraft. The death of Theodor Eike was treated as a major loss by the Nazi leadership. Heinrich Himmler personally wrote his obituary, praising him as one of our most faithful and reliable SS leaders. Adolf Hitler authorized the renaming of one of the Totenkopf division's regiments in Eike's honor. Nazi propaganda portrayed him as a martyr who had given his life for the fatherland. Even his former enemies in the SS bureaucracy, who had clashed with him over jurisdiction and resources, acknowledged his contributions to the Nazi cause. But from the perspective of justice, Eike's death was a catastrophe. Here was a man who bore more responsibility for the Holocaust than almost anyone except Hitler and Himmler themselves. He had created the organizational structure that made systematic murder possible. He had trained the personnel who carried out that murder. He had established the psychological framework that allowed ordinary Germans to become genocidal killers. And he had died in combat before he could be held accountable for any of it. The question that haunted post-war investigators was whether Eike's death really constituted an escape from justice. In one sense, he had paid the ultimate price, his life, for his service to the Nazi cause. But that death had come as a soldier in combat, not as a criminal facing execution. He had died believing he was a hero rather than a war criminal. He had never been forced to confront the magnitude of his crimes or face the judgment of his victims. More troubling was the fact that Eike's system had outlived its creator. Even as he was dying in a burning aircraft over Ukraine, concentration camps across Europe were operating according to his specifications. The men he had trained were implementing the policies he had established. The organizational structures he had created were facilitating the murder of thousands of people every day. In a very real sense, Theodor Eike had achieved a form of immortality through his systematic approach to genocide. The camps that bore his organizational fingerprints would continue operating until the very end of the war. Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Mauthausen, all of them reflected the template he had established at Dachau in the 1930s. The commandants who ran those camps had been trained in his methods or trained by men who had learned from him. Even in death, Eike remained the architect of systematic murder. So can the dead escape justice? In Eike's case, the answer seemed to be yes. He had never been forced to account for his crimes, never been made to face his victims, never been compelled to acknowledge the evil he had unleashed upon the world. He had died with his reputation intact among his Nazi colleagues, and his conscience apparently clear. Death had provided him with the perfect alibi. He couldn't be held responsible for crimes committed after February 1943, and he couldn't be prosecuted for crimes committed before that date. But perhaps there was a different kind of justice at work. Theodor Eike had lived to see his beloved Nazi empire beginning to crumble. He had witnessed the defeat of his armies, the retreat of his forces, the collapse of his ideology. He had died knowing that everything he had worked for was failing, that his life's work was being destroyed, that history would judge him and his cause as evil. In the end, maybe that was justice enough. 1977. A quiet suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. An elderly Ukrainian immigrant named John Demjanjuk was working his shift at a Ford auto plant, just like he had been doing for decades. His neighbors knew him as a quiet, hard-working family man who had fled the chaos of post-war Europe to build a new life in America. He coached his son's soccer team. He attended church regularly. He was living the American dream. What his neighbors didn't know was that John Demjanjuk was about to become the center of the most controversial Nazi war crimes case in American history. Holocaust survivors had identified him from old photographs as Ivan the Terrible, a sadistic guard at the Treblinka extermination camp who had operated the gas chambers and tortured prisoners for his own amusement. After 30 years of living as an ordinary American citizen, Demjanjuk's past had finally caught up with him. The discovery of Nazi war criminals living normal lives decades after the war became one of the most shocking revelations of the late 20th century. While the world had focused on the high-profile trials of concentration camp commandants in the 1940s, thousands of lower-level perpetrators had successfully disappeared into new identities. They had immigrated to the United States, Canada, Australia, and South America. They had become citizens, raised families, built careers, and integrated completely into their new societies. The friendly butcher who cut your meat might have been a former SS guard. The elderly man who bagged your groceries might have operated gas chambers. The hunt for these hidden Nazis began in earnest in the 1970s, led by organizations like the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and driven by Holocaust survivors who were determined to see justice done before they died. These weren't professional investigators or government officials. They were elderly Jewish survivors who had dedicated their remaining years to tracking down the men who had murdered their families. They pored over immigration records, analyzed old photographs, and interviewed other survivors, looking for any clue that might lead them to a war criminal. The breakthrough in the Demjanjuk case came when researchers at the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service discovered that he had lied on his immigration forms. When applying for entry to the United States in 1951, he had claimed to be a victim of Nazi persecution who had spent the war working on farms. But investigators found evidence that he had actually served as a guard at multiple Nazi extermination camps, including Sobibor, Treblinka, and Flossenburg. The quiet auto worker was allegedly one of the men who had helped implement the final solution. What made the Demjanjuk case so compelling and so controversial was the question of whether investigators had identified the right man. Holocaust survivors who had been imprisoned at Treblinka positively identified Demjanjuk as Ivan the Terrible, describing him as an unusually sadistic guard who seemed to enjoy inflicting pain on prisoners. They remembered him operating the diesel engines that pumped carbon monoxide into the gas chambers. They recalled his brutality during the selection process, when new arrivals were divided between those who would be killed immediately and those who would be worked to death. Their testimony was vivid, detailed, and absolutely convincing. But Demjanjuk maintained his innocence with equal conviction. He admitted that he had served in the German army after being captured as a Soviet prisoner of war, but claimed he had never worked at any extermination camps. He argued that he was a victim of mistaken identity, that survivors were confusing him with someone else after decades of traumatic memories. His family and supporters portrayed him as a scapegoat, being prosecuted for crimes committed by someone who happened to look like him. The case became even more complex when investigators discovered that the Soviet Union had provided key evidence against Demjanjuk, including an identification card showing him as a guard at Treblinka. But could evidence from the Soviet government be trusted? Were the Soviets trying to deflect attention from their own collaboration with Nazi war crimes? The Cold War politics surrounding the case made it difficult to determine what evidence was genuine and what might have been fabricated. In 1986, after years of legal battles, John Demjanjuk was extradited to Israel to stand trial for crimes against humanity. The trial was broadcast around the world, giving viewers a glimpse into the ongoing struggle to hold Nazi war criminals accountable decades after their crimes. Elderly Holocaust survivors took the stand to confront the man they believed had tortured and killed their friends and family members. The courtroom scenes were emotionally devastating. 90-year-old witnesses pointing accusingly at an 80-year-old defendant, both claiming to be victims of Nazi persecution. The Israeli court convicted Demjanjuk and sentenced him to death, but the case took another dramatic turn when new evidence emerged, suggesting that Ivan the Terrible might have been a different person entirely. Documents discovered after the fall of the Soviet Union indicated that the real Ivan the Terrible was probably Ivan Marchenko, not Ivan Demjanjuk. The Israeli Supreme Court overturned the conviction, ruling that reasonable doubt existed about Demjanjuk's identity. He was released and returned to the United States, where he resumed his quiet life in Cleveland. But the Demjanjuk case wasn't over. In 2009, nearly 30 years after the original investigation began, German prosecutors filed new charges against him. This time, they weren't claiming he was Ivan the Terrible at Treblinka. Instead, they argued that documents proved he had served as a guard at the Sobibor extermination camp, where he had participated in the murder of at least 28,000 Jews. At age 89, Demjanjuk was once again facing extradition and trial for Nazi war crimes. The German trial of John Demjanjuk began in November 2009, making him one of the oldest people ever prosecuted for war crimes. The proceedings were unlike anything the world had seen before. An ancient defendant who had to be wheeled into court on a stretcher, facing charges for crimes committed nearly 70 years earlier. Holocaust survivors, now in their 90s, testified about events they had witnessed as teenagers. The courtroom became a surreal intersection of past and present, where the very old were confronting the very old about events from their distant youth. The German court convicted Demjanjuk in May 2011, sentencing him to 5 years in prison for his role as an accessory to murder at Sobibor. but he died in March 2012, while his appeal was still pending, meaning that under German law his conviction was automatically nullified. John Demjanjuk went to his grave still claiming innocence, and the legal system never definitively determined whether he was a war criminal or a victim of mistaken identity. The Demjanjuk case highlighted the enormous challenges of prosecuting Nazi war crimes decades after they were committed. Witnesses were dying of old age. Documents were lost or destroyed. Memories became unreliable after 70 years. Defense attorneys argued that it was impossible to guarantee fair trials when both accusers and accused were in their 80s and 90s. Critics questioned whether justice was really being served by prosecuting elderly men for crimes they may or may not have committed as teenagers. But for Holocaust survivors, the pursuit of Nazi war criminals remained a sacred obligation regardless of the passage of time. Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Nazi hunter who dedicated his life to tracking down war criminals, put it simply: justice delayed is not justice denied. He argued that there could be no statute of limitations on genocide, no expiration date on accountability for the worst crimes in human history. Every Nazi war criminal who lived freely was an insult to the memory of their victims. The modern hunt for Nazi war criminals has been race against time. By the 21st century, most of the perpetrators were in their 80s or 90s, and Holocaust survivors were dying at a rate of dozens per day. Organizations like the Simon Wiesenthal Center launched Operation Last Chance, a final push to identify and prosecute the remaining war criminals before death made justice impossible. They offered rewards for information, used social media to spread awareness, and lobbied governments around the world to prioritize these cases. Some of the discoveries were shocking in their ordinariness. In 2014, investigators identified Oskar Groening, a 93-year-old man living quietly in Germany who had worked as a bookkeeper at Auschwitz. His job had been to count and catalogue the money and valuables stolen from Jewish prisoners before they were murdered. For decades, he had lived as a respected member of his community, working as a factory supervisor and raising a family. His neighbors were stunned to learn that the elderly man next door had been part of the machinery of genocide. The emotional impact of these late-life prosecutions was profound. Holocaust survivors in their 90s were finally getting their day in court, confronting the men who had destroyed their families and their communities. Eva Kor, an Auschwitz survivor who had been subjected to medical experiments by Dr. Josef Mengele, testified at Groening's trial. She was 81 years old and had been waiting 70 years for this moment. Her testimony was a powerful reminder that the victims of Nazi crimes had never forgotten, never forgiven, and never stopped seeking justice. But the late-life prosecutions also raised difficult questions about the nature of justice itself. Was it meaningful to prosecute men who were so old and frail that they might die before their trials concluded? Did these elderly defendants pose any threat to society that would justify the enormous expense and effort of prosecution? Were these trials really about justice? Or were they simply symbolic gestures designed to make Holocaust survivors feel better? The answer, according to prosecutors and survivors, was that justice has no expiration date. The passage of time doesn't diminish the enormity of genocide or reduce the obligation to hold perpetrators accountable. These prosecutions were sending a message to future generations that certain crimes are so heinous that they can never be forgiven or forgotten. they were also providing closure for survivors who had spent their entire adult lives waiting to see their tormentors face justice. Even if the defendants were too old to serve meaningful prison sentences, the act of prosecution itself had value. As the 21st century progressed, the window for prosecuting Nazi war criminals was rapidly closing. Most of the perpetrators had died, and most of the survivors were following them to the grave. The last major Nazi war crimes trial might have already concluded, with the last defendant having already died. Soon the Holocaust would transition from living memory to historical record, and the pursuit of justice would become impossible rather than just difficult. But the legacy of the long hunt for Nazi war criminals extends far beyond the specific cases that were prosecuted. These investigations established important precedents for international justice, proving that war criminals could be pursued across borders and decades. They demonstrated that ordinary citizens could become instruments of justice, tracking down perpetrators when governments failed to act. Most importantly, they sent a message to future genocidaires that time and distance would not protect them from accountability. The hunt for Nazi war criminals became a template for pursuing justice in every subsequent conflict, from Rwanda to Yugoslavia to Syria. The story of the ones who got away is ultimately a story about memory, justice, and the refusal to forget. While some Nazi war criminals successfully hid among us for decades, living normal lives and dying peacefully in their beds, others were eventually discovered and held accountable. The fact that this pursuit continued for 70 years after the end of World War II is a testament to the determination of Holocaust survivors and the principle that some crimes are too terrible to be forgiven by time. So here we are, at the end of our journey through one of history's darkest chapters. Let's take a moment to consider what we've learned about justice, about evil, and about the price of forgetting. Of the major concentration camp commandants, justice found them all, some quickly, some slowly, but it found them. Joseph Kramer, the Beast of Belsen, was executed within 8 months of Germany's surrender. Rudolf Höss, the architect of Auschwitz, was hanged at the scene of his greatest crimes. Amon Goeth, the sadistic butcher of Poisson, faced his victims in a Polish courtroom and died on a gallows that struggled to claim him. Even Karl Otto Koch was executed by his own SS comrades when they decided he had gone too far. Only Theodor Eicher escaped earthly justice, and only because a Soviet anti-aircraft gun did what prosecutors never got the chance to do. But even in death, Eicher couldn't escape the judgment of history. His system crumbled, his ideology was defeated, and his legacy became a cautionary tale about the bureaucratization of evil. The pursuit of these men revealed something profound about the nature of justice itself. It's not just about punishment, it's about acknowledgement, accountability, and the refusal to let evil hide behind the excuse of following orders. When Rudolf Höss sat in that Polish prison cell writing his autobiography, he was doing more than confessing his crimes. He was documenting for history exactly how ordinary bureaucratic procedures could be twisted into instruments of genocide. That documentation became crucial evidence, not just for his prosecution, but for understanding how such horrors could be prevented in the future. But the lesson of these men goes far beyond Nazi Germany. The most chilling revelation from studying their lives is how utterly ordinary they were before they became monsters. Höss was a farmer's son who wanted to be a priest. Kramer was an unemployed electrician looking for work. Goethe was a shopkeeper who worked in his parents' bookstore. None of them started out as sadistic killers. They became sadistic killers through a process of gradual moral compromise and institutional permission. This is perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from their stories. Evil rarely announces itself with horns and a pitchfork. It usually arrives wearing a uniform, carrying official paperwork, and claiming to serve a higher purpose. It transforms ordinary people into perpetrators through small steps, each one seeming reasonable in isolation, until suddenly they're standing in the middle of an atrocity, wondering how they got there. The concentration camp commandants didn't wake up one morning and decide to commit genocide. They started by accepting that some people were less deserving of rights than others. They progressed to believing that harsh treatment was necessary for national security. They evolved to seeing their victims as obstacles to be removed rather than human beings to be protected. Each step built on the previous one, creating a moral slide that ended in mass murder. This progression isn't unique to Nazi Germany. We can see similar patterns in every genocide, every ethnic cleansing, every systematic persecution that has followed. The specifics change, but the underlying mechanism remains the same. Ordinary people are gradually conditioned to accept the unacceptable until the unthinkable becomes routine. The concentration camp commandants were products of this process, not exceptions to it. That's why the pursuit of justice for these men was so important, and why it continued for decades after the war ended. Every Nazi war criminal who lived freely sent a message that genocide could be gotten away with, that systematic murder could be explained away as following orders, that the passage of time could erase the most heinous crimes. The relentless hunt for these perpetrators sent the opposite message. There is no statute of limitations on mass murder, no safe haven for those who implement genocide, no excuse that will absolve participation in crimes against humanity. The Holocaust survivors who dedicated their later years to tracking down war criminals understood this instinctively. They knew that their pursuit wasn't just about personal revenge or closure. It was about establishing a precedent that would deter future genocides. Every Nazi brought to justice was a warning to potential perpetrators in other times and places that accountability would eventually come, even if it took decades. The modern relevance of these stories cannot be overstated. We live in an age where authoritarian movements are rising around the world, where democratic institutions are under attack, where minority groups are being scapegoated for societal problems. The same psychological mechanisms that created Nazi concentration camp commandants are at work today, in different contexts, but with similar potential for horror. Understanding how ordinary people become perpetrators is crucial for preventing future atrocities. The commandant's stories also illuminate the crucial role of institutional resistance to evil. In every case, these men operated within systems that not only permitted their crimes, but actively encouraged them. They had legal authorization for their actions, bureaucratic support for their methods, and ideological justification for their goals. The Nazi state had created an environment where mass murder became not just acceptable, but professionally rewarding. This teaches us that preventing genocide requires more than individual moral courage. It requires institutions that refuse to legitimize evil, even when it's popular or profitable to do so. Perhaps most importantly, these stories remind us that vigilance is the price of civilization. The concentration camp system didn't appear overnight. It developed gradually, through small compromises and incremental steps that each seemed reasonable in isolation. By the time the full horror was visible, it was too late to stop through normal political processes. Prevention required early recognition and immediate resistance, not later prosecution and punishment. The lesson, then, is not just about Nazi Germany or concentration camp commandants. It's about the eternal human struggle between civilization and barbarism, between individual conscience and institutional pressure, between moral courage and comfortable complicity. It's about the responsibility each of us bears to recognize evil in its early stages and resist it before it becomes unstoppable. The men whose stories we've explored tonight were not born monsters. They became monsters through choices they made, step by step, day by day, until they had traveled so far from their humanity that there was no way back. Their crimes were made possible not just by their personal moral failures, but by societies that stopped asking difficult questions, institutions that prioritized efficiency over ethics, and populations that chose comfortable ignorance over uncomfortable truth. Justice found these men, eventually. Some faced the gallows, others died in prison, a few were executed by their own comrades when even Nazis decided they had gone too far. But the ultimate justice isn't just in their punishment. It's in ensuring that their crimes are remembered, their methods are understood, and their choices serve as warnings for future generations. That's why we tell these stories. Not to sensationalize evil or satisfy morbid curiosity, but to understand how ordinary people can become capable of extraordinary evil, and to arm ourselves with that knowledge against the forces that would make monsters of us all. The concentration camp commandants remind us that the line between civilization and barbarism runs not between nations or peoples, but through every human heart. And it's up to each of us to decide which side of that line we'll stand on when the test comes. Because make no mistake, the test always comes in every generation, in every society. And when it does, the stories of these men remind us that there are no neutral choices, no innocent bystanders, and no acceptable excuses for complicity in evil. Justice may be delayed, but it cannot be denied forever. And memory, however painful, remains our best defense against repeating history's darkest chapters.